Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. If you'd like, you can move to the front, and member states are invited to speak to the colleague from DGACM to take their nameplates, and then they will be plated. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, it is my privilege to welcome you to the last plenary session of the committee consultations with civil society. I would therefore like to inaugurate forthwith the third panel. Our plenary session will discuss, the third panel, correct. 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. Apologies, everyone. Sorry. So our last plenary discussion will discuss the implementation of General Assembly Resolution ES 1024, ending the illegal occupation. This afternoon, we have the privilege to host a larger panel with 5 panelists from different backgrounds. We will hear interventions from representatives of solidarity movements and organizations from Sweden, Spain, South Africa, and the United States, as well as from the former Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. I would like to use this moment to encourage our speakers to speak at a normal pace for translation. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon, a friend and esteemed colleague, Mr. Michael Lynk. Mr. Lynk served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the Palestinian Territory, occupied since 1967. He held that post from 2016 until 2022. He has co-authored and edited several books, including most recently Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, Working Through the United Nations, co-authored with former Special Rapporteurs Richard Falk and John Dugard, and International Law and the Middle East Conflict, co-edited with Susan Akram, Michael Dumper, and Ian Scobie. I would also like to highlight his crucial support and work with the committee on the study on the legality of the Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Thank you, sir, for making the time to be with us today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. My grateful thanks to the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People for the invitation to be part of this conference and this panel regarding both the historic Nakba and the ongoing Nakba. I'm going to present a short series of slides to accompany my presentation. Who should I be telling to advance the slides? Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Okay. Since 1948, there is wait. Okay. Since 1948, there's never been as dark a time for Palestine as during the last 19 months, with more than 50,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, with more munitions dropped on Gaza than fell on London, Dresden, and Hamburg combined during the Second World War, with Gaza now resembling a lunar landscape that Israel has intended to be uninhabitable for the Palestinians, although not, perhaps, for American real estate developers. With large-scale starvation not looming, but now fully upon us, and with ethnic cleansing on the immediate horizon. This is a moment of truth for our political system, international political system, and for international law. But if every major international crisis is a moment of dread, it also is or can be a moment of opportunity. As the first speaker on this panel regarding the implementation of UN Security Council resolution, I'm going to call it 1024, my task is to lay out the accountability findings of the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice from last July and the monumental directions established by the General Assembly in 1024 when it welcomed the ICJ advisory opinion this past September. So as a prelude to discussing this, I would like to emphasize two significant imperatives that we have to keep in mind. First, impunity, or the lack of accountability, is the hole in the heart of modern international law. While we shouldn't be starry-eyed about international law, it is imperative to recognize that building and enforcing an international rule of law is one of our greatest common goods. There is and always will be a struggle between law in the service of power and law in the service of justice. And strengthening international law means strengthening the forces of justice. And second, Palestine and Gaza lie at the very fracture point of modern international law. On the one hand, international law so strongly supports the rights of the Palestinians, including their right to be completely free from an unlawful occupation and domination, their right to self-determination, and their right to insist upon criminal accountability for those who have committed flagrant violations of international law against them, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. On this point, international law was not meant to be an umbrella that folds up at the first sign of rain. But international law is a creature largely of our international political system, with the 5 victors of the Second World War granting themselves permanent veto powers over the enforcement of decisions and advisory opinions coming from the International Court of Justice. International politics, and particularly the role of the United States, has ensured that hundreds of resolutions from the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council criticizing Israel for its violations of international law and its scorning of the directions coming from the United Nations has gone unanswered and unenforced. The question of Palestine is the oldest current ongoing issue at the United Nations agenda since April 1947, more than 78 years ago, and we are further from a just and durable resolution than ever before. So, turning to our discussion for this theme of this panel on the importance of UN General Assembly Resolution 1024 from last September, I have 3 points to make. First, and yes, I want to remind us that the United Nations has been insisting upon that Israel comply with international law for more than 5 decades to no avail. If you look at the first slide that's there, in June of 1980, almost 45 years ago, which is an eternity in international law, but apparently a very slow moment in Israel's rule over the Palestinians, the United Nations Security Council, the highest-ranking body in our international system, adopted Resolution 476. The resolution said many important things, but 3 points stand out for our purposes, which are on the slide. First of all, the Security Council reaffirmed the overriding necessity for ending the prolonged occupation of Arab territories occupied since 1967. The Security Council said this in 1980, only after 13 years of occupation. Secondly, the Security Council said that it strongly deplores the continued refusal of Israel to comply with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. To put it another way, the Security Council was already recognizing in 1980 that Israel was a bad faith and acquisitive occupier in 1980. And thirdly, the Security Council said in 476 that in the event of non-compliance by Israel with the present resolution, it would examine practical ways and means to ensure its compliance with implementing the resolution to fully end the occupation. As you may guess, that never happened. So what we have here is the acquiescence of the international political system not to impose costs upon Israel for defying UN resolutions, for defying international law. And what does an outlier country that defies international law and UN resolutions wind up learning from that experience? So now my second area of exploration goes to the remarkable advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice last July. I am mentioning the advisory opinion because it is the necessary prelude to General Assembly Resolution 1224. The push to have the UN General Assembly ask the ICJ for an advisory opinion on whether the Israeli occupation had now become unlawful came from the Palestinians, and particularly key Palestinian diplomats in Ramallah, Geneva, and here in New York. I know something about the arduous background to getting to The Hague and the ICJ in this matter, and I want to salute those skilled Palestinian diplomats whose efforts resulted in one of the most significant decisions ever made in the 80-year history of the International Court of Justice. So for our purposes, the ICJ's advisory opinion said 6 important things, and there you can see I've got 5 of them up there listed. I'll be very brief in just pointing them out. It said that Israel's ongoing occupation was unlawful, full period, full stop. Secondly, it said that Israel had to end the occupation as rapidly as possible. Thirdly, it said that Israel's under an obligation to cease all settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the OPT. Fourth, it said that the State of Israel has an obligation to make reparation for the damages to all persons in the OPT who've suffered damages, which is virtually everyone living there. Fifth, it said that all states, and this is going to be something to keep in mind when we turn to the UNGA resolution, all states are under an obligation not to recognize Israel's unlawful presence as legal and not to render aid or assistance. And 6, what I don't have on the slide, and please accept my apologies for not having it there, it also said that Israel's policies and practices in the OPT breach Article 3 of the 1965 International Covenant for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which in Article 3 specifically forbids racial segregation and apartheid. So what the ICJ said is that apartheid is in a needlessly soft voice, but they said it nevertheless. It did affirm the existence and prevalence of racial segregation and apartheid in the OPT. My third and final area of review in this panel's focus is on the UNGA resolution from last September, Resolution 1024, which was passed overwhelmingly. I think the vote was 120 in favor, and I think it was only 14 votes against. First, the UNGA resolution focuses on Israel's obligations, which I summarize here in the slide. In some important ways, the UNGA actually strengthened and went beyond the directions that were in the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. In the ICJ's direction, as you'll recall from a few minutes ago, it said that the occupation must end as rapidly as possible. The Security Council went one step further. In 1024, it gave Israel and the international community a specific deadline of exactly 12 months after the passage of the General Assembly resolution, which would be 18th September 2025, 4 months from now. This occupation must end completely, fully. From Resolution 1024, we also know that Israel is required to fully and completely end the occupation, going back to the pre-June 1967 Green Line, and to completely evacuate its 360 plus settlements and its 740,000 Israeli settlers. One last point on Israel's obligations. It is required to make reparation for the damages caused to all persons in the OPT, echoing what the ICJ had said. This establishes a responsibility for the General Assembly and the United Nations to create an active registry and to build a database to accept claims for damages. The next slide lays out the obligations of the international community to demand that Israel obey and to make Israel obey the directions of the advisory opinion as refined by Resolution 1024. And you can see the 7 obligations of the international community. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the most important ones are to promote the realization of Palestinian self-determination, not to recognize as lawful the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied territory, to abstain from entering into treaty relations or trade relations with Israel when it's acting on behalf of the occupied Palestinian territory, to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in Israel's illegal presence, including the settlements, to bring to an end Israel's systemic discrimination, including racial discrimination and apartheid, in the OPT to a complete end, and finally, to end the importation of all products originating from the illegal Israeli settlements. I will leave it for my fellow panelists to detail how global civil society is organizing to realize the fulfillment of these obligations. My last slide goes to the bodies and organizations that are instrumental in enabling international accountability for Israel to follow and apply the directions of the ICJ and the UN General Assembly. Each of these bodies has its possibilities. Each of these bodies has its challenges. The United Nations Security Council is, of course, the single most powerful international decision-making body in the UN system, but is hobbled by the veto power of the Permanent Five, and especially by the United States' promiscuous use of the veto power to shield Israel. 49 times in the last 50 years, the United States has issued vetoes in support of Israel, including 5 times since October 7th. The General Assembly is the most democratic body in the UN system, but it has limited decision-making powers to impose meaningful sanctions. The International Criminal Court has the authority to try and to charge individuals who may have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity or even genocide, but it is dependent upon the 124 members of the court to enforce its arrest warrants and to deliver suspects to The Hague. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is the highest-ranking court in our international system, but it does not have its own police. It does not have its own army to enforce its decisions and opinions. It depends entirely upon the UN Security Council to do that. Regional bodies have the power to shape and to break trade and diplomatic relations with outlier countries. But they often have difficulty, such as the European Union or the African Union, in speaking and acting with one voice. That means the final body that we have here, civil society, we have to place great hope in the work and the activism of international civil society organizations from whom almost all positive change in the world winds up emanating. Civil society organizations, they give us vision, they give us energy, they give us direction, they give us activism, and most of all, they give us moral courage. So let me give you my concluding remarks with respect to this. The takeaway points from the advisory opinion of the ICJ and the demands of UN Security General Assembly Resolution 1024 is the absolute minimum necessary to establish a genuine path for Palestinian freedom and liberation. This has to reverberate everywhere. And while we may insist upon, what we must insist upon with all regards to the upcoming international summit in June at the United Nations, organized on Palestine and co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, is that it not simply take as its goal returning the world to the way it was on October 6th. That would be a monumental failure of the First Order. Instead, I put to you that the international summit must be guided by 5 points in particular. First, the framework for fully ending the occupation must be a rights-based approach anchored in international law and human rights, not in realpolitik. Second of all, whatever political framework winds up being established between Palestinians and Israelis, the end goal must be a political framework that ensures equality for all between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. Thirdly, we have to accept, because the International Court of Justice has said so, that Israel is not only a bad faith occupier, it is an unlawful occupier. Fourthly, because of the vastly asymmetrical differences in power between Israel and the Palestinians, active international intervention anchored in international law and UN resolutions is indispensable for the path to liberation. And finally, the occupation must end and end with all deliberate speed, and that consequences must flow from the occupation not ending after the 18th of September 2025. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much,
Thank you, Michael, for your very comprehensive presentation on the obligations and responsibilities for all states in accordance with UN resolutions and the imperative of implementation of General Assembly Resolution ES 1024, including in the context of the upcoming international conference on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the two-state solution. I think that what you've outlined for us in terms of the accountability findings of the ICJ advisory opinion are important for everyone to bear in mind as we move forward. And of course, those findings were reflected in General Assembly Resolution ES 1024. And I think it was also important that you reminded us of the long history of UN legislation from 1980 calling for an end to all settlement activities, the evacuation of all settlers, and critically, an end to the occupation. And so when the court calls for ending the occupation as rapidly as possible, and the General Assembly calls for ending the occupation within 12 months, those who think that this is not in the realm of possibility, we should remind ourselves that this was asked for decades ago, over 4 decades ago already, by the Security Council in binding resolutions. And so thank you for that, and also for always reminding us that the enforcement of international law is one of our greatest common goods, and it is existential for Palestine that the law be upheld, but I think that we're in a moment right now for the international community where it's existential for all. So thank you again. And just a final word on Mr. Lynk's support during the ICJ advisory opinion proceedings. I want everyone to know that Michael Lynk was a very trusted member of the legal counsel for Palestine during the ICJ advisory opinion proceedings, in the run-up to the proceedings and all throughout. And your reports as Special Rapporteur and your legal support, we greatly benefited from it and have deep gratitude for it. Thank you. Our second panelist today is Mr. Magnus Wallen, Diakonia Head of Office in Sweden and Senior Policy Advisor. He has extensive experience in Swedish aid policy and advocacy work and is an important and often sought-after voice in the aid debate. Mr. Wallen has long followed developments in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Israel-Palestine, as well as the issue of Swedish arms exports. Diakonia International Humanitarian Law Center is an extensive repository of Israeli human rights and humanitarian law violations in the Occupied Palestinian Territory and has long been a helpful source for the committee to reference in its work. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends. Forgive me, Mama, the 24-year-old Rifat Radwan said as he lay dying, shot by Israeli soldiers, while he was on a rescue mission on March 23 in Gaza. His mobile recorded the video until his last breath. The video found on the deceased phone and released by Palestine Red Crescent Society shows the final moments as the Palestinian medics, wearing highly reflective uniforms and inside a clearly identifiable ambulance when they were attacked and killed. Forgive me, Mother, this is the path I chose to help people, the Palestinian paramedic said before he died. I come as a representative for Diakonia, a development human rights organization. We have existed since '66 and are working with partners for a just and equal and sustainable future in 20 countries. As you might have heard earlier, on a personal note, I'm happy to be back in the UN after many, many years. In the 80s, I participated in meetings organized by the UN Center Against Apartheid, headed by the now late E.S. Reddy. Those meetings were, I think, very central, and early 80s was also a starting point for global coordination for many anti-apartheid organizations globally, working for sanctions against apartheid South Africa. I should talk a bit about EU and Sweden in relation to the ICJ process and where we are. There's a lot to talk about the June meeting. I would say that in the EU perspective, the next week's Foreign Affairs Council will be very important, and the position put there. But as you also heard, Diakonia has a special humanitarian law center, which is an independent group that provides rapid and in-depth legal advice, training, and advocacy on the laws of war and to ensure the protection of people in conflict zone worldwide. But we also have a special Jerusalem desk that produces a number of studies and reports on occupied Palestinian territories and can be found on the internet. We recently produced a legal analysis of the destruction of healthcare in North Gaza, and in-depth analysis of the measures taken to restrict civic and humanitarian space in Israel and the OPT. The present escalation of the war in Gaza did not come as a surprise. In May 2023, more than 500 former military chiefs of staff, cabinet ministers, and commanders in the Israeli security establishment warned in an op-ed in Times of Israel that the annexation politics and the direction towards a one-party state reality also threatens Israel's security. The former commanders wrote that Gaza will not be quiet. When the International Court of Justice, in the July advisory opinion, concluded that Israel's continuation presence in the occupied Palestinian territory was unlawful and that Israel has annexed a large part of the OPT, that shows to me that EU has failed in its politics. EU has, in its own reports, over decades, year after year, yearly report, documented how Israel violates international law with the settlement constructions, land seizures, destruction of Palestinian property, but EU has not responded in any action to these violations. EU holds significant leverage over the Israeli government, not just the United States. EU is the leading partner in terms of trade and investments. EU supplies at least a third of the Israeli arms import. And Israel has a comprehensive association agreement, which in its paragraphs is conditional on the respect for international law, and particularly humanitarian law. EU have produced hundreds and hundreds of statements criticizing this, but there has been very little action. This is in very stark contrast how EU has responded to Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine. And this double standards weakened the EU standings, not just in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And EU has a duty to prevent genocide. And Sweden and EU is not powerless to stop these abuses. From the Swedish perspective, we have a foreign policy declaration which states that international law is a cornerstone of the Swedish foreign policy, and that Israel has an obligation to protect civilian population in Gaza and to ensure access to humanitarian aid. But when we see these violations, the Swedish government has chosen not to act in accordance with these commitments. and these principles. So we need a sharp change of policies in Sweden and in EU. We call for a number of things. Firstly, we say that Sweden should reconsider its aid strategy and aid policies. In December 2024, the government decided to stop to support the UN agency UNRWA, and is now the only actor that has the capacity to deliver large-scale humanitarian aid for Palestinian refugees in Gaza, West Bank, and the neighboring countries. The government refers to that other actors can do this, but the UN experts and other countries have determined that there is no other sustainable alternative. And now Sweden is the only country in the EU that has continued to defund and stop this funding for UNRWA. They think and say that this is a way to avoid the refugee problem, which we know is not correct. At the same time, Sweden has withdrawn for the important human rights organization in Palestine, breaking contracts. And the occupation is not even mentioned in the aid strategy for the West Bank. And these actions have worsened an already urgent situation. To me, this is quite shameful, I must say. So we want support for UNRWA, the Palestinian organization, and the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Accompaniment Program providing international human rights observers should be resumed. We also think that EU, as a priority now, must reject Israel's and US efforts to use aid as a tool for military and political purposes. And that must be on the agenda on the upcoming Foreign Affairs Council. And Sweden and EU have to implement and follow up the International Court of Justice ruling, as secondly. It actually, I mean, the International Court of Justice orders international community not to contribute to maintaining the illegal situation. And that applies to all kinds of economical relations. Sweden imports and exports military equipment from Israel, and Sweden has not called for a banning of trade with illegal settlements. It should ask also EU to stop military support and cooperation with Israel, and suspend all activities that risk making Sweden complicit in violation of international law. We call for an arms embargo. And when it comes to, thirdly, when it comes to the association agreement, Sweden should call the EU to ensure compliance with the EU agreement with Israel. Ahead of the most recent Foreign Affairs Council, the EU Association Council meeting in February, he adopted a common position demanding Israel a number of measures in Gaza and in West Bank. It's a long list, but it's very obvious that Israel have ignored all these demands. Instead, Israel has worsened the situation, have blocked aid, escalated airstrikes in Gaza, increased abuses in the West Bank, with hundreds of deaths, injuries, and displaced Palestinians as a result. So Sweden should also, in relation to the association agreement, support and vocally support those countries that demand suspension of the association agreement. And that number, I understand, is increasing almost by the day now. So Europe can no longer allow that one or two dissident countries hold foreign policy hostage. And we should also call for sanctions against Israeli actors, including politicians and military commanders, responsible for serious crimes in Gaza and the West Bank. So the EU and Swedish government in action contradicts its own commitments, and this has a human cost. Sweden and EU must change course to stop abuses and stand up for justice, human rights, and a rule-based world order. The family to the paramedic Rifat Radwan and all other victims deserves justice, accountability, and truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wallen, for sharing with us your reflections based on over 6 decades of work, and your insights from a Swedish perspective, including regarding the defunding of UNRWA, and from a European perspective as well as a humanitarian perspective. The leverage that is regrettably not being used to pressure Israel to halt its grave breaches and respect international law, and the need for a change of course of action for accountability is, as you said, it's imperative, it's elemental for saving lives, for advancing justice, and ultimately advancing the realization of the freedom, peace, and dignity that's been denied to the Palestinian people. So we thank you for your contribution today and your long-standing efforts. Thank you. We shall now continue with another Europe-based civil society organization, RESCOP, which stands for Red Solidaria contra la Ocupación Palestina. Its spokesperson, Ms. Elise Sampson-Estapi, is here with us today. She is a sociologist, a feminist, and anti-racist activist. She was the European coordinator of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions in Israel movement, and is a member of the board of NOVACT, which defends life and freedoms in the Euro-Mediterranean region and promotes a fair and lasting peace through the strengthening of civil societies in conflict prevention. Alice focuses on the corporate abuse in the occupied Palestinian territory. Madame, you have the floor.
Thank you. Dear colleagues and distinguished delegates, today I bring the voice of hundreds of thousands from Spain who say, enough complicity, enough deceit. In March 2025, the Spanish Prime Minister described the massacre of 400 Palestinians killed in a single day as sad, atrocious, unacceptable. What is also sad, atrocious, and unacceptable is that Spain still maintains military ties with Israel. Over the preceding months, Spain exported military parts to Israel and imported bombs and grenades worth millions of euros. This lays bare a deep contradiction. While condemning atrocities, the Spanish government continues to arm, finance, and sustain the culprit. Despite government claims, Spain has never suspended military ties with Israel. Transfers, imports, exports, arms fares, they all continue. Since autumn 2023, Spain has acquired Israeli weapon systems worth over 1 billion euros, part of an arms trade that continues despite Israel's occupation, apartheid, sustained ethnic cleansing, and genocide of the Palestinian people. Ships carrying weapons and military equipment for Israel continue to pass through Spanish ports. These vessels, moving with secrecy and impunity, have transported military vehicles and components for warplanes of the same type used by Israel in Gaza. Spain has stood out for its criticism of Israel's military attacks on the Gaza Strip, yet this position contrasts sharply with its long-standing military and diplomatic ties to Israel. Research shows that these ties have intensified. The arms trade and cooperation are more active than ever. Without any doubt, Spain is complicit in Israel's genocidal apartheid regime. What you finance, you support. Over the last 19 months, hundreds of thousands have filled the streets in more than 100 cities across Spain, demanding an end to the arms trade and military cooperation with Israel. Last Saturday, 100,000 people from across Spain filled the streets of Madrid to demand the government to cut all ties. The people will not stop until justice is served. Meanwhile, the level of violence and destruction in Gaza is beyond words. Experts estimate the real death toll is far higher than official figures. This is not a war. It is a genocide carried out by a settler colonial regime that enforces apartheid through mass killing, forced displacement, starvation, and siege. The world's legal and moral obligations are clear. Denunciation without action is mere rhetoric that allows oppression to persist. Spain must end all forms of complicity in Israel's egregious actions, and those responsible must be held to account. RESCOP, the Solidarity Network Against the Occupation of Palestine, has coordinated Palestine solidarity efforts in Spain for over 20 years. Today, it plays a central role in building pressure to end Spain's complicity in Israel's settler-colonial regime of illegal occupation, genocide, and apartheid. Through the Stop the Arms Trade with Israel campaign, RESCOP has brought together over 600 organizations across the country to make complicity impossible to deny or maintain. We have built this pressure through sustained strategic action, coordinating monthly mobilizations in dozens of cities, engaging with workers who have refused to handle weapon shipments bound for Israel, relentlessly exposing every military agreement, launching legal actions, and working with researchers and media to expose government lies. Last July, we registered a draft law at the Spanish Parliament that, if passed, would directly apply an arms embargo on Israel. We are building a movement that is broad and impossible to silence. Since we launched the campaign in November 2023, this pressure has resulted in key victories. 3 ships have been turned away from Spanish ports. 2 more ships changed course in face of public outcry. Israel was excluded from Spain's largest arms fair. On April 26, Spain announced the cancellation of an already formalized €5.5 million ammunition deal with Israeli arms manufacturer IMI Systems. These are small but significant cracks, proof that pressure works and that governments can move when people organize and rise up. But it is not enough. We cannot keep going ship by ship, contract by contract. We need structural, legal policy change that translates obligations under international law into formal, binding, and lasting measures to end complicity. That means adopting a comprehensive military embargo. No exports, no imports, no transit, no cooperation, no contracts. This must cover weapons, military material, and dual-use surveillance and border technologies. Given the atrocities Israel has been committing since 1948 throughout Palestine, an arms embargo is the bare minimum, a legal and moral obligation. Israel not only uses repression against Palestinians, it exports it to the world. It is a laboratory of death, where systems of surveillance and killing are tested on Palestinians, then marketed globally as combat tested. In Spain, we know this all too well. Pegasus spyware, developed by an Israeli company, was used to attack civil society, journalists, and politicians. What's tested on Palestinians is exported to harm us all. The call for a total arms embargo on Israel comes from Palestine, from Palestinian civil society, from survivors, from those held captive in Israeli jails, from those who live under occupation and bombardment every day. We are here to amplify their call, because it is not only theirs, it is a call of humanity. Israel's crimes are crimes against humanity. It is a universal moral imperative. At a time when many states are increasing military spending, Spain included, we are here to say that this is not the path to peace, justice, or security. The world needs investment in health, education, and social justice, not more weapons. Spain, of course, is not alone in its complicity. The European Union as a whole maintains deep political, economic, and military ties with Israel, including the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which grants Israel privileged access despite apartheid and war crimes. The EU is an enabler, complicit in maintaining the very structures of apartheid and occupation. We have the power and the duty to act. Governments must redirect resources away from destruction and towards life. Dismantling the structures of war also means building the foundations of peace with justice and dignity. Today, here from the United Nations, we demand the Spanish government impose a total arms embargo on Israel now. End all form of military collaboration now. Abandon the supply chain of genocide now. A Spanish arms embargo is essential. but it must be applied by all government. What we demand of Spain, we also demand of the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and beyond. This is not only about the security of Palestine, it is about the security of all humanity. Whether you pull the trigger, sell the gun, or open the door to let the weapon through, you are part of the chain. You are complicit. Every arms shipment to Israel deepens complicity with genocide, and there is no justification possible. We know arms embargoes work. The arms embargo on apartheid South Africa played a key role in ending the regime. The same must happen now. The international community must not wait. There are no legal obstacles. All that is missing is the political will to act. We should not have to remind UN member states of your international legal obligations to take action to prevent genocide. As you all know, the International Court of Justice, in its 2024 advisory opinion, reaffirmed the illegality of Israel's occupation, described it as apartheid, and reaffirmed the states must not assist or uphold it. That includes halting arms transfers and military cooperation that risk enabling the ongoing atrocities. Spain is failing in its duty to prevent genocide and live up to its declarations. In the face of the terrifying rise of the far right everywhere, governments that claim to be progressive must now, more than ever, move beyond rhetoric and demonstrate principled leadership. Governments have a choice: continue financing the machinery of death or stand up for life, peace, dignity, and justice. The choice is simple. The time is now to decide on which side of history you stand. End the flow of weapons. Arms embargo on Israel now. End the complicity now. Viva Palestina Libre. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Estape, for your very powerful intervention, highlighting both the duty and the power and the responsibility to act. Thank you for bringing the call for an end to complicity, including a halt to all arms transfers to the Israeli occupation, and calling for an end to the double standards and for respect for international legal obligations that uphold the rule of law, that protect human rights, and that fully end complicity in occupation, in apartheid, in genocide. Thank you also for sharing with us the impact of RESCOP's efforts, proving that pressure does work and must be amplified, including to secure a comprehensive arms embargo. Thank you. I would like to now invite our fourth expert to make her presentation, Ms. Roshan Dadu. Ms. Dadu is currently coordinator of the South Africa BDS Coalition and a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. She previously worked as a regional advocacy officer and director of a civil society migrant rights organization, Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in South Africa, as well as for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, where she served in the Middle East section at the South African Embassy in Algeria. Prior to that, she was an activist in the anti-apartheid movement and Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Madam, you have the floor.
If destroying all the maps known would erase all the boundaries from the face of this earth, I would say, let us make a bonfire to reclaim and sing the human person. Refugee is an ominous load, even for a child to carry. For some children, words like home could not carry any possible meaning, but displaced, border, refugee, must carry dimensions of brutality and terror past the most hideous nightmare anyone could experience or imagine. Empty their young eyes, deprived of a vision of any future they should have been entitled to, since they did not choose to be born where and when they were. Empty their young bellies, extended and rounded by malnutrition, and growling like the well-fed dogs of some with pretensions to concerns about human rights violations. Can you see them now, stumble from nowhere to nowhere, between nothing and nothing? Consider their premature daily death of their young dreams, What staggering memories frighten and abort the hope that should have been an indelible inscription in their young eyes. Perhaps I should just borrow the rememberer's voice again while I can and say, to have a home is not a favor. This poem could be written about the ongoing Nakba, about the over 700,000 Palestinians turned into refugees, ethnically cleansed from their land 77 years ago as the Zionist militias carried out their violent settler colonial project to establish the State of Israel, or about the displacement over and over again happening right now in the genocide in Gaza, as apartheid Israel's bombs rain down, as over 60,000 people have been murdered, with countless more lying under the rubble, as an entire population is facing starvation amongst the litany of war crimes being committed right now with impunity by the apartheid state of Israel. Scholasticide, ecocide, reproductive genocide, the list goes on, as apartheid Israel accelerates the realization of its founding principle of ethnically cleansing the Palestinian people from their land. But in fact, the poem was written by a South African poet, Keorapetse Kgotsitsile, who died in 2018. He was a cultural worker and activist in our liberation movement, exiled as a young man in 1961. He returned 29 years later to live in a post-apartheid South Africa, where he was conferred the honor of Poet Laureate, although he did always remain a critical voice. Growing up in exile from apartheid as I did, the right of return is not only an existential longing, it's not only a collective embodiment of resistance to profound injustice passed down through generations. Although it is all of this, I want to remind ourselves that it is also a right enshrined in international law, arguably customary international law, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And yesterday we heard from a speaker who lives in the belly of the Israeli settler colonial beast. We heard about the centrality of the right of return in any so-called solution. The Palestinian people's right to self-determination and the right of return, enshrined in Resolution 194, cannot be shoved aside by plans made, as the poem says, by those with pretensions to concerns about human rights violations. At this UN Nakba Day event, where state parties are considering the actions they have committed to in last September's UN General Assembly resolution, and they also seem to be preoccupied with preparing for the upcoming June conference, I think it is important to remind ourselves of this. It is also crystal clear, at least to South Africans, that an apartheid state should be suspended from the UN, as was apartheid South Africa, and not least in the case of apartheid Israel. I mean, are you really going to allow a rogue state that shreds the UN Charter in the chamber, that criminalizes UNRWA, bombs its schools and infrastructure, murders its personnel to remain with full rights within the very United Nations Israel seeks to destroy, along with the international legal system it upholds? I mean, will you really allow Israel to continue its assault with impunity on UNRWA in a horrific attempt to totally erase the reality of Palestinian refugees, those that we have just reminded ourselves have a right of return? Furthermore, while it's vital that the June conference outcomes are concrete actions with a transparent follow-up mechanism to hold states accountable, the commitments you made, state parties, last September in the UNGA resolution to uphold the ICJ advisory opinion are not sequential. There are clear actions you can take right now, as we have heard from other speakers on this panel and yesterday. And so it is strange that there seems to be a sense of despondency amongst member states, given the urgency. I think this morning, Chair, you said that 200 people have been killed in less than 24 hours. I mean, you really clearly have not done all that you can, not even to fulfill what you have already committed to. And we have heard from speakers on the panels a menu of detailed actions you can take. And this is not new to state parties. You've taken these actions before against apartheid South Africa. In fact, I should say actions that you must take, not only to prevent and punish, but in order to not to be complicit yourselves, as the ICJ ruling on provisional measures in the case South Africa has taken against Israel under the Genocide Convention has legally obliged you to do. So what are you all waiting for? More urgently, as Shahiva and Saleh Hijazi outlined this morning, and as Alice has just spoken so eloquently about, a comprehensive arms embargo, stop exporting, importing, and allowing transit for weapons and dual-use material, including energy. You can literally stop the genocide. We are campaigning to ensure South Africa declares an embargo on coal sales going to Israel. Yes, you might be surprised, but South Africa is in the top 3 largest exporters of coal, which goes into the Israeli electricity grid and fuels the genocide and illegal settlements. In the largest exporter, Colombia, has declared a coal embargo. So you see, it is possible. And we in South Africa, we know that BDS works, that international solidarity in support of our struggle, driven by people power around the world, eventually saw countries one by one taking the measures that led to sanctions. Interestingly, since 1970, half of the US vetoes have been to block international criticism of Israeli violations of human rights and international law. What is less well known is that 1/3 of the US vetoes were to block international criticism of apartheid regimes in southern Africa. So basically, over 80% of US vetoes since 1970 have been to block international criticism of apartheid regimes. Yet, here I am, having exercised the right of return. As Phyllis Bennis said earlier, thanks to the popular pressure from people around the world that forced governments, even the most reactionary Western governments at the time of Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, apartheid supporters to the bitter end, to finally take measures to impose sanctions on oil and arms embargo, sports and cultural boycotts that stung the psyche as well as the economy of the white supremacists, amongst many other measures. And what was extremely important was the way in which solidarity movements intersected with the UN and member states, facilitated by the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid and the Centre Against Apartheid. The re-establishment of the committee, given its track record, is the appropriate mechanism to give expression to operative paragraph 14 of the General Assembly resolution to follow up on violations by Israel of Article 3 of the CERD and call for sanctions. It will address Israel's crimes against humanity of apartheid as a crucial component of Zionist settler colonialism systematically carried out by the State of Israel, and as the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 says in her report of September 22, address the experiences of Palestinian people in its entirety and in their unity as a people, including those who were displaced in 1947 to 1949. Our former President Mandela expressed this in his 1990 visit to the United Nations when he said, I quote, "We'd also take this opportunity to salute the Special Committee Against Apartheid, which has been and is a very important instrument in our struggle against the iniquitous and oppressive policies of the South African government. We salute also the states that make up its membership, which have been unrelenting in their resolve to contribute everything they could to ensure the world was mobilized to act against this apartheid system," end quote. Don't you want to be in their number? Wouldn't you want to be one of those state parties praised by someone like Nelson Mandela? But it's not just in the United Nations that we need to ensure member states are active on the issue. Countries in Africa and in the global south took the lead in our struggle, and we can keep the issue of Palestine on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council and force the US to a veto. Keep passing strong resolutions with overwhelming majorities like last year in September in the General Assembly that activists can use to pressure our governments and keep the issue of Palestine on the agenda of regional bodies. Our Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network raised a resolution committing to ending complicity, raised the resolution in the African Commission on Human and People's Rights last year, which was adopted, and state parties actually went up to them and expressed full support. This is in line with the African Charter that obliges on human and people's rights, that obliges states to fight against all forms of racism, including Zionism. And it was the Global South, in particular, former presidents, MPs, jurists, and diplomats from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, including the OIC, that have already endorsed the demand for reactivating the special committee, and that the UN Secretary General has reported on. Additionally, the Hague Group, that was formed initially by 9 countries of the Global South, including South Africa, to support each other's efforts in implementing the legal obligations on state parties, is another example of how countries standing together in informal groupings can better resist pressure from the United States and from other powerful countries. And we very much hope that more countries will join. This morning, Salih Hijazi outlined a long list of BDS movement successes. No state party, including my own, can rest on their laurels when millions of people around the world are taking action to disrupt business as usual. We, the people, are the force that can force states to end complicity, to prevent and to punish, to stand on the right side of history. For most of my life, I never thought I would be able to return to a South Africa free from apartheid and to be able to continue our ongoing struggles for economic justice, solidarity, and equality from home. As our former president and freedom fighter, Nelson Mandela, said so profoundly and presciently, our freedom, and that's all of our freedom, is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Amandla! Free, free Palestine!
Thank you so much, Ms. Dadu, for your inspiring remarks and for sharing your wisdom and traveling so far to join our consultations in New York. We commend your advocacy in South Africa, which remains a valuable partner and member of this committee. And we thank you for underscoring the inviolability of the right of return and the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, and the call to states and the reminder that they have not done all that they can to end the atrocities and end this unbearable human suffering and to resolve justly this historic injustice. And your calls for respect of obligations and commitments now to make the difference we all seek, including through boycott and sanctions, has been heard. Thank you, Madam. It is now my pleasure to introduce our last speaker of the afternoon, Mr. Philip Farah. He is a Palestinian Christian born and raised in East Jerusalem with family roots in Gaza. Mr. Farah is a founding member of the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace and Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. He also served on the United Church of Christ Palestine-Israel Network Steering Committee. Mr. Farah, you have the floor.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for allowing me to offer these remarks on behalf of my organization, the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, PCAP. I grew up in Jerusalem. I was born 4 years after my family was ethnically cleansed from what became West Jerusalem. I was arrested at the age of 27 and under administrative detention and tortured to confess to false charges. As you probably know, administrative detention is one where you are not subjected to a formal trial, and you are not aware of what the charges are against you other than that you are a threat to the security of the state. While I grew up in Jerusalem, my family roots are in Gaza, where I still have some relatives. I've estimated that Christians accounted for about 9% of the population of Gaza in 1948. Today, after 77 years of Israeli belligerence towards the Palestinians, fewer than 1,000 Christian individuals remain in the Gaza Strip. Practically all of them are sheltering in the campuses of the two major churches in Gaza, the Catholic Church of the Holy Family and the Orthodox Church of St. Porphyrius, the third oldest church in the world. Israel bombed St. Porphyrius on October 19, 2023, killing 18 of the Christians sheltering there and severely damaging the church. My relative, Ilham Farah, an 84-year-old woman, beloved music teacher in Gaza, survived the bombing. But 3 weeks later, an Israeli sniper shot her in the leg. She got on her cell phone, pleading for help, but anyone trying to save her was shot at. So she bled for many hours. The next morning, an Israeli tank went over her. We don't know whether she was still alive or dead by then. Pope Francis condemned her killing and the cold-blooded shooting deaths of 2 other women while they were inside the walls of the Catholic Church. Another relative died in the arms of her son, a physician, because Israel's blockade meant that he did not have the simple medicines that could have easily saved her life. She was one of many thousands of Palestinians who died not as victims of lethal weapons supplied mostly by the US, but as victims of Israel's withholding of food, water, and medicine, and the destruction of hospitals, clinics, and sanitation infrastructure. All those sheltering in the 2 Gaza churches, like the rest of Gaza Palestinians, are now facing the prospect of an agonizing, slow death from starvation. Yet state authorities around the world, with the exception of a few honorable outliers, are failing to abide by their duties under international law of implementing measures to sanction Israel for the 19-month long orgy of killing. In contrast, civil society organizations have stepped up in support of the Palestinian people. Notably, civil society organizations around the world have responded to the 2005 call by Palestinian NGOs for an international movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Other speakers have given examples of major successes of the BDS movement around the world. My focus is on Christian groups in the US that have answered the BDS call. In 2009, Palestinian Christian leaders published the Palestine Kairos document, which called on Christians around the world to adopt boycott and divest, among other things, to adopt boycott and divestment measures in support of the Palestinian struggle for freedom. The word Kairos, meaning moment of truth, was inspired by the 1985 Kairos document of the South African church leaders calling for international solidarity to end apartheid. Christians of various denominations in the US had already started forming groups to lobby their denominations for solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, and some started pushing for boycott and divestment. In fact, in 2004, the year before the CSOs in Palestine issued their BDS call, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Presbyterian activists convinced their church, their denomination, to adopt, quote, phased selective divestment from certain corporations operating in Israel. It took a while before the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church, made a definitive decision to divest their pensions funds from Caterpillar, Motorola Solutions, and Hewlett-Packard for profiting from contracts that assist Israel in maintaining its occupation. The news of the resolution made the front page news of the New York Times. A group of us formed the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace in 2012. While we do a variety of activities, a primary focus is to be a resource for allies in the churches who lobby their denominations to implement boycott and divestment sanctions. Our inspiration comes from the South African struggle against apartheid. We believe that our fight gains crucial victories when we start winning over large segments of mainstream civil society. Churches are as close to the center of mainstream society as can be. Israelis who view themselves primarily as part of a superior Western world, although over 50% of the Jews in Israel are actually from Arab countries, are ethnically Arab, are deeply shaken when they see that their public and private institutions are the subject of boycotts and divestment actions by CSOs in the West. Today, nearly all major mainline Protestant denominations in the US, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, etc., have adopted boycott and divestment policies in support of the Palestinian struggle. Outside of mainline Protestant churches, the picture is more varied. The Catholics have stayed out of the divestment movement, while the majority of Baptists and evangelical Christians have generally supported Israel. However, progressive Catholic organizations such as Pax Christi, Franciscan Action Network, Catholic Worker, and others are increasingly engaging in protesting Israeli occupation practices. Next week, the Veterans for Peace, which is a largely secular organization, is going to start a hunger strike outside of the United Nations, and a number of Christian organizations, Methodist, Catholic, etc., have signed up to join. And even among evangelical Christians, we are making inroads. According to an Israeli opinion survey, support for the state of Israel among young evangelicals fell from 69% in 2018 to 34% in 2021. The grassroots movements in the US and the UK eventually forced the legislature in both countries to oppose apartheid South Africa, the regime in South Africa. And finally, the Reagan and Thatcher governments came around kicking and screaming, had to fall in line. We in Palestine Solidarity Movement are not there yet, but there are indications that we may be headed in this direction. Former EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell recently stated that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and France's President Macron has called on the EU to look at its trade agreements with Israel over its 10-week total blockade on Gaza. But most governments around the world have not yet taken material steps to stop Israel from continuing its genocidal war. Government lawyers in the UK are arguing that Britain's national security interests in continuing supply parts to the F-35 fighter bombers outweigh the risk of genocide in Gaza. Imagine. While France's Macron, who made that statement, seems to downplay the need to push Israel harder because, as he put it, quote, France alone, even with other Europeans, can put all the pressure of the world on Israel, but Netanyahu does not depend on us. He depends on US weapons. This failure to take action is complicity in genocide, and the excuses are disingenuous. They don't pass the laugh test. If major Western powers start acting in decisive ways as they are required under international law, Israeli society will have to wake up from its hubris. The stronger, as this happened in South Africa, The stronger the protest movement of CSOs around the world, the more likely the governments will start complying with their obligations under international law of ending Israel's occupation of Palestinian land and its genocidal practices against the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for sharing with us the tragic stories of your relatives in Gaza lost in this genocide and of the suffering and trauma being endured still by the survivors. Thank you also for sharing with us your insights from a Christian perspective. We commend the work of faith leaders and organizations for peace in the Middle East, and we recognize the importance of your collective advocacy efforts, including here in the United States, needed now more than ever. Faith-based organizations are invaluable partners of the committee, and we are always keen on enhancing that partnership. Thank you. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready to start our discussion. Participants are welcome to ask questions or make comments on the presentations of our esteemed panelists. We'll take a few comments and questions from the audience, and then our speakers will have an opportunity to respond. Once again, please introduce yourselves at the beginning, and please make your interventions as brief as possible. Thank you. Do we have any requests for the floor?
Since we moved to a different room, you would have to raise your hand, and then we will try to see you. There you
Go ahead, on.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bari Mahmoud. I am a student, recent graduate, and I am a part of the Palestinian American Community Center in New Jersey. I'm here as a representative of the center. I am a Palestinian American, born and raised in the U.S., and I wanted to first, I had two things that I wanted to point out first for the panelists, for the esteemed panelists. But to preface a little, I wanted to speak to the impact that the Zionist occupation has had on Palestinians in the diaspora, specifically in the U.S., and how Palestinian civil society organizations in the U.S. have been responding to them. And speaking from our perspective as a local community organization, we have felt a huge brunt of the load. And you know, Mr. Lynk, I thought very much since you put up the tools of accountability and the order in which they were in. And one of my thoughts were that if we think of the order of effectiveness or the order of importance, it could be framed in whichever way you could think of. I'm of the opinion that it would be flipped on its head. And so, obviously, I like to speak more before I give you the opportunity to respond, but I want to give a story on a month ago, a Palestinian American teenager, as well, three Palestinian American teenagers living in the occupied West Bank on April 6th were shot at 46 times in a village of Turmus Aya in the occupied West Bank. Amir Rabi', Ayub Jbara, and Ahad Shhada were shot at 46 times by Israeli occupation forces while they were picking green almonds. Amir was shot at 11 times and was killed. Ayub and Ahid were critically injured And Ayub actually arrived yesterday to the United States to receive treatment for his critical injuries. Ayub grew up about an hour away from here and was born in the US and holds American citizenship. And it wasn't until us at the center, at the Palestinian American Community Center, held a press conference, reached out to local officials, federal officials, state officials, until statements were made regarding his murder. The amount of work that Palestinian civil society takes the brunt of for movement to happen is not light whatsoever. And especially on the part of Palestinians in the US who face a variety of repression tactics, such as anti-BDS legislation that is hoping to adopt definitions of anti-Semitism which claim that criticisms of Israel and of Zionism are anti-Semitic. This is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which has been adopted by many states in the US and institutions and city councils, but it is on the local and state levels that these are being combated. And these are the fights, and these are the things that are happening that aren't put on an international stage, but all of these small fights, all of these small battles are increasingly becoming more and more important to the fight for Palestinian liberation. And Mr. Farah, I actually was going to ask if you could speak more on the way that Christian Zionism in the US is actually the leading force of Zionism in America. The vast majority of Zionists in the US are Christian. They do not come from Jewish backgrounds. It is evangelical Christians who are the leading population of Zionists in the US, who identify as Zionists. And so, just as a way of kind of grounding, and thinking over, obviously this is the last session of the past 2 days. I've been here since yesterday. This is my first time even at the UN in my life. But just listening to everything and thinking about all the conversations that are being had, I feel that it's more and more important on an everyday level to kind of sit back and consider what Palestinians, obviously in Gaza, the genocide that they're undergoing, obviously in the occupied West Bank, the apartheid, and the settler violence, but even Palestinians in the diaspora, around the world, the repression and anti-Palestinian discrimination, and even the violence that is being enacted upon us. To think about that in our decision making and in our conversations, and in thinking about the conversations that are being had on the summit next month, or the conference, which I recently just learned about. These are also things that need to be in consideration. Is how are these conversations going to protect Palestinians around the world? And I hope that we can all come away with these thoughts and solutions to these very serious problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. And since the morning and today, especially since we've heard from Mr. Philip, Alice, and Roshan, this reflection of the global movement that is targeting complicity. And this is what we've been highlighting from the morning. Zionist settler colonialism is able to reach a stage of genocide live streamed because of the complicity of states, corporations, and institutions. I have a question for each of the panelists, if you allow me. And first, Professor Lynk, thank you very much. And I echo the appreciation and thanks of Ambassador Abdulhadi for all the work. My question is about the legal implications of having the power to prevent genocide or having the knowledge and the ability to stop complicity in genocide and not doing so. What does this mean to states, or even, if I may also ask about corporations and individuals within corporations? And I want to ask the same thing about, aiding and assisting in maintaining an illegal situation in apartheid. What is the legal implication of that? Would that incur criminal liability? That's my question. To Alice, thanks again. To Rescop, to you, all the work. I was wondering if you could also say a little bit about the work across the Mediterranean, because what is happening in Spain in the ports and stopping of the ships, we have other countries in the Mediterranean. When Spain, for example, shuts down one port to one ship, it goes somewhere else. And we know that there is a network that is growing of work across the Mediterranean, if you would be able to kind of say something about that. And Roshan, the same goes with kind of Africa. Me and you were in Dakar when we launched the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network of civil society organizations from over 24 countries that was grounded in the African Charter for Peoples and Human Rights, which is the one regional instrument that still condemns Zionism and calls on African states to eliminate Zionism as they would with apartheid, colonialism, and neo-colonialism and imperialism. And in November last year, the African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights issued its first resolution in 24 years, referencing the ICJ advisory opinion, the ruling, the provisional ruling in the case of genocide, and called on African states not to aid and abet in Israel's apartheid and to work to prevent genocide. If you could tell us also a little bit more about how much there is work being done and groups being now mobilizing and organizing across Africa. And finally, to Mr. Philip, about me and you had a brief discussion yesterday about the impact that churches have once they start adopting divestment and BDS. And I was hoping you could tell us also a little bit about that and where we could also go from here in terms of getting more and more churches to adopt BDS and to divest themselves from funds and companies that are complicit in Israel's crimes. Thank you.
If I can take the opportunity then to answer the questions as they were directed towards me. The first, very good questions coming from the student. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Okay. And what you'd raised with me was the flipping of the order. I actually it was deliberate in the order that I put, because I was saying each of the first 5 bodies with respect to accountability were bound to fail and have been failing with respect to this, which is why, therefore, the need for the real global superpower that we have, which is civil society, and the activism of informed citizenry, is going to have to lead us out of this and to put pressure on the General Assembly, on the Security Council, on their own governments, in order to be able to live up to the political and the legal standards that they have themselves have promised to wind up obeying and committing themselves to. So that was the reason, that was a thought pattern behind why civil society became number 6 in there, because the first 5 were failing us, and therefore it was going to be left, as it usually is, to civil society to make the kind of advances, to grow rights, to expand, if you like, the liberal space for us to be able to criticize when we see injustice in the world, and particularly with respect to a genocide. With respect to Salah's question, to me you've asked, what are the legal implications with respect to preventing genocide, and what are the obligations of other countries who wind up being complicit in it? You know, the most obvious ones being the United States or Germany, who supply something like 98% of the arms exported to Israel, or other countries who fail to do anything, even when they have much less political or economic sway on Israel, of doing nothing or virtually nothing with respect to trying to isolate an outlier occupying power and an outlier genocidal country from continuing on the path that it's there. I'm often reminded of the words of Albert Camus, the French literary laureate, who said that describing things by their wrong names only adds to the afflictions of the world. And I often say that now when I'm speaking about genocide, because we can no longer go around saying, you know, the G word. You know, it has to be out front and present. And we see more and more organizations or more and more formal officials. I wish someone like Joseph Borrell was brave enough to say genocide when he was actually in a seat of power as of last November. But at least he said it. He said it now. I'm also reminded of a biography I read, or a memoir I read of Anthony Lake. Anthony Lake was a foreign policy advisor to Bill Clinton in the first administration of the Clinton presidency. And he said in 1994, there was a fierce debate going on in the White House about whether what was going on in Rwanda met the standard with respect to genocide. And junior officials were going to the Genocide Convention, going to previous examples of where the Genocide Convention had been played or had been imposed or possibly applied to say, this has all the markings of a genocide. And of the senior officials in the White House who pushed back with regards to that, they didn't want to hear the G word, because as Anthony Lake said, if the G word was actually pronounced and said by the president or by his senior officials, that would have obliged the United States to do something meaningful to bring it to an end. And as we know, the United States abstained from doing anything till long afterwards. And whether it's to his credit or not, Clinton went at the very end of his presidency to Rwanda and wound up paying homage to the genocide memorial that was there, much too late for the 800,000 victims of the genocide. So this is, you know, in many ways the same reason why we see Europe and North America so unwilling to be able to pronounce the G word when it comes to what's going on in Gaza, because under Article 3E of the Genocide Convention, you are as equally liable under the Genocide Convention for complicity in genocide, and that would always include that those with arms and who don't have arms embargoes, who are continuing to supply Israel with guns and weapons and missiles and F-35s. But it also applies to those who don't actively take a position of cooperating with each other to bring to an end serious violations of international law, which would include war crimes, which would include crimes against humanity, and would certainly wind up including genocide as well. I'm reading a book right now, which I highly recommend to people, by the Canadian-Egyptian author Omar al-Akkad. Someday, everybody will have always been against this. And I can't think of a more appropriate title with respect to that. Do we have to wait 20 years for historians and journalists to write about the history of 2024, 2025, and talk about why this was allowed to go on with everybody seemingly against us, when virtually none of our political leaders could do more than make sanctimonious occasional comments with respect to starvation or the images of children now, but that doesn't move them to do much more than making these words. So legally speaking, you know, genocide is a powerful weapon. Genocide was put into law in 1948 because it was deemed to be the crime of crimes in the aftermath of the European Holocaust. These, I think, are reasons why they won't, but these are reasons why we've got to make them wind up doing this.
Yes. So with respect to the Christian Zionists, absolutely, you're right. That's a huge challenge. Christians United for Israel accounts, I think, by their own claim, they claim 5 million or 6 million supporters around the U.S. but groups of Christians have protested, progressive Christians have protested their annual conferences. Last year was really a tremendous show of force of progressive Christians who disrupted their conference in Washington, D.C. In July is their next conference, and there will be many Christian organizations even participating in civil disobedience to disrupt their conference. But like I said, even among evangelical Christians, especially among younger evangelical Christians, support for Israel is really declining. And this is extremely alarming for Israel. Like I said, the opinion survey showed that even by 2022, before this genocide started, the support among young people, young evangelicals dropped from 2018. It was, I think, 60-some% down to 33% in 2022, and this is before the genocide. So even there, and some Christian groups, we are actually gaining ground with evangelical groups. There are now evangelicals for Palestine groupings around the country. With respect to Saleh's question, at the heart of this, the impact of, like I said, churches are at the center of mainstream society. And the model that I think we are following, really, all of us in the progressive NGOs and CSOs space, is that, struggle starts with the oppressed themselves, who are, of course, very marginalized. The movement for the emancipation of slaves started with the slaves themselves. And, it starts gaining support outside of that group to maybe intellectuals, maybe some students, also kind of marginalized people. But once it gets to the, it's the same with the civil rights movement, with the movement against the war in Vietnam. But when you get to the churches, that's really getting to the heart of the mainstream. And now the legislature has to pay attention. And then, as in the case of South Africa, Reagan and Thatcher, was forced, kicking and screaming, to fall in line. And I think that's the model for, and in the churches, it's not only the Christian Zionists, it's also many of the so-called liberal churches, even the ones that have adopted resolutions for divestment and boycott of Israeli companies and companies that profit from, international companies that profit from the Israeli occupation. Even there, it's always the grassroots that has to push the leadership. The leadership is very reluctant. Today, only 3 denominations that I know of the leaders have actually mentioned the genocide word. The United Church of Christ, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Church of the Disciples, relatively small. And now the, Presbyterian grassroots is, pushing their leadership to adopt, to condemn what's happening as genocide. So, we still have a challenge even in the churches.
First of all, I'd just like to thank the Palestinian comrade for your comment you made, and just fully agree on the role of the diaspora or Palestinian diaspora in organizing, and just fully agree and also recognize the work Palestinians everywhere do, and as well the Palestinians in the Spanish state play a key role in all the work we do in RESCOP, and I just thought I'd mention that. Then on Saleh's question, first of all, I think it's very important to mention how Spain, due to its geographical position, is a key player for all of the transit of weapons towards Israel. So even though it's super important that through popular pressure we managed to get the Spanish government to deny port of 3 boats, and there are other 2 that, thanks to public outcry, they didn't stop in Spanish ports, we're seeing that this is happening on a weekly basis. So we're talking about 19 months of genocide. We can calculate that the amount of ships we're talking about that are going through Spanish ports and going to Israel to assist military to Israeli genocide. But as Salo was saying, we're not just implementing a state campaign, but we're trying to coordinate throughout the Mediterranean. The whole logic is we're going boat by boat and port by port, because those ships that don't stop in Spanish ports stop in other ports. And I wanted to highlight the most recent example that I think illustrates very well this international complicity and all the roles that different ports play. It's important to mention Maersk, the Danish company, which is responsible for many of these boats, the biggest transport company in the world. It's also important to say that many of the transit of these boats, they are patterns. So they're very easily identifiable because they're doing the same routes, most of them coming from the US, passing through Spain and stopping in the same port. So they're easily identifiable for governments to actually take action. And there was the recent 2 boats from Maersk, one that was coming from the US and the other one was coming from France, and they were stopping in different places and then meeting in Tangier, where they were going to exchange, and they were going to, the one coming from the US was going to give weapons to the other one, and the other one was heading to Israel. And here it's very important to say, like in the southern France, dock workers there, because they refused to handle the ship, there was the ship was delayed and it came to Barcelona, for example, it came late. The same happened in Valencia, where dock workers refused to handle the ship, so there was also delay. And then it was also important to say that there was huge protests in each of these ports, but there was huge protests in Tangier, where both boats met. Unfortunately, the exchange of weaponry happened and the boat made it to Israel. But this shows very well this pattern of all the role the different international ports are playing, and how we need all of these states to stop allowing ships that are transporting or we know that are going to transport military equipment to Israel. I think it's also important to say in Spain we have 3 US military bases where the Spanish government has absolutely no control of what is happening there, and this is another clear example of US imperialism and the effects it has everywhere. And also important to say a small but powerful victory we've had in every boat that we know. There's a lot of secrecy and a lot of impunity with all military deals, but every boat that we know that's coming to a Spanish port, we present a legal complaint. And last week we learned that the 2 captains of this boat in the court of Barcelona have been called for an investigation. So that's important, and we're going to follow up with that.
Yes, just on Salih's question, I did refer briefly to the African Commission and the resolution that was put, but it's very important as a mechanism, I think, for us in the African continent, and something that, because given the support and the support of state parties for that resolution, and that it being the first time in how many years? 24 years. And given that, you know, there's a huge support for Palestine within the African continent, because people recognize it as an anti-colonial struggle, an anti-imperialist struggle, and there are groups growing up all the time around BDS groups and solidarity groups across the continent. But just picking up on from Alice and the ships, of course now, because ships are rerouting and not going up the east coast of our continent and through the Red Sea, we're having a lot more of these ships that are carrying often also weapons coming from the Far East across the southern African coast and up the west coast of Africa. And like with the Mediterranean, we had a successful, in the sense of delaying a ship, investigating the contents, finding that indeed it was carrying 3 cases of explosives that are used to make cluster munitions heading to Israel to be manufactured into those weapons by Elbit Systems. The ship was called the Catherine. And again, it's that amazing ability now of people, us, civil society activists, to be able to track ships on ship tracking apps, to see what they're up to, and then to put pressure on governments where you see that that ship is looking to dock. And we really wanted to commend Namibia, because once we saw that the ship was heading into a port in Namibia, the Namibian government immediately investigated the content, and that was how it was verified, exactly what was on board, and then took away the permission to dock. So the ship was sort of hovering around, and it didn't dock anywhere up the west coast of Africa. It kept hovering about. Then when it reached into the Mediterranean, there were also actions across the route from activists in all the different countries that delayed and protested at the ports, and I think dock workers in some of the ports also were part of that. So there is an amazing way. We have the possibility to literally try to stop the weapons reaching to Israel, and to put pressure on our governments why they are not taking action, why they should be making those legal obligations realizing them so they are not held complicit. So that's just some of the things around Africa, but also just to pick up on the Christian Zionism question. It's not just in the US. I think the really big challenge is in Africa and Latin America, from Christians, the Hasbara and the money that's been put by Israel into this campaign of Christian Zionism. It's the biggest challenge we have in our continent. Low churches, evangelical churches, but also traditional churches, which isn't specifically the theology of Christian Zionism, but also have an inability to take a position, largely because on our continent they depend on funding, and their sort of parents in Europe or in the United States. Massive churches in Nigeria that promulgate, things like this prosperity gospel and so on. All of those churches influence people, and people who, they influence people who are in political parties, everyone who goes to these churches and trade unions. And it is a big challenge, and we're really trying hard to galvanize. And I'm glad to hear more I'd like to hear more about the Christian initiatives, because activists in our continent are trying to form those sort of groups that upfront the fact that as Christians, you are saying we should stand with Palestine, stand against the genocide, implement BDS. It's really a big problem. So thanks for raising that.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Again, my name is Nick Modern. I'm campaigning to ban weaponized drones. And I thought Mr. Lynk had a very important point, and I'd like to see him put it in an op-ed piece for the New York Times, which says that we're at a position in the world where only people in the streets are going to put a stop to this. And I think the danger I feel in just being part of this group is that when things enter into this forum, it's like there's a process, let the process work itself out. It's like saying my house is on fire, but let the process work it all out. And I was feeling ideally we would be holding this whole forum out on the middle of First Avenue and blocking up traffic while we have this conversation. Now, you might think that's very extreme and this guy's a little bit crazy. But, when we deal with people in Northampton, Massachusetts, and trying to get them into the street, there's a real caution. Oh, we want to be careful. We don't want to use the G word. We don't want to say this. We don't want to say that. And that's why we're in this situation. And I feel that if people like Mr. Lynk, other people, would write op-ed pieces, would say we have to get out in the street now, because the normal process are absolute abysmal failure for reasons we don't completely understand. It could be a huge help in this country to make nice white people decide they should get out in the street. Thank you.
I have a short question for all 5 speakers. Do we have time for this? Or? Yeah. So I wanted to ask, first of all, Michael, when you spoke about the resilience of international law, do you have an example of a state that has been a third-party complicit state in the violation of international law and was held to account in some way? So in terms of its complicity with a crime committed by another state rather than by its own, which is something very relevant for our work. My question to Philip, this is as a man of faith, I wanted to ask you about the word tragedy, which I am always trying to avoid in describing the suffering that Palestinians and the killing of Palestinians now in the genocide or in general in the course of the occupation and the ethnic cleansing, because personally I would be offended if somebody would say that the family, my family that was killed in the Holocaust has experienced a tragedy. The word tragedy implies that the tragic hero is somehow taking an action that brings about his own doom and therefore carries some kind of blame. And I wonder what you feel about this and whether you agree that the word is inappropriate or if I'm misplacing my point here. My question to you, Alice, is about finding the right line between praising actions, because you've obviously criticized the Spanish government for its complicity, and rightly so. We sometimes are at odds on this issue because compared to other countries, the Spanish government has gone a little bit further, and it could be used to shame other countries to take better steps. But on the other hand, can we make that demand of other countries when we are at the same time criticizing the Spanish government, and how do we know what is the right balance between these two things? My question to you, Roshan, is a little bit difficult because I think we need to try to learn from the South African experience. You've studied and written about Israeli spyware. And this is a strong example of how the Israeli system of oppression and technology of oppression is causing harm all over the world. I think every state represented here in this meeting has their own citizens being affected by harmful Israeli technology of oppression that has been exported after it was tested on Palestinians. We are seeing this happening now because as the military embargo is growing, already the 3 largest Israeli spyware companies have relocated. And NSO Group relocated to Luxembourg, Intellexa to Cyprus and Greece, and Paragon to the United States. So the oppression and the violation of human rights is crossing the borders. And in what way can we make sure that, and the reason I'm referring this question to you is because we know that this is exactly what happened with South Africa, that as apartheid fell, the experts in technology of oppression and practices of oppression formed companies such as Executive Outcomes and continued to export this technology even when the apartheid regime has already been dismantled. And how can we learn from that and avoid that in the future to make sure that the struggle against Israeli oppression doesn't end doesn't fail in focusing in only one place. And my question to you, Magnus, and apologies for sitting directly behind you, is about Europe rearm. And we've seen now how European governments are, you've mentioned it yourself, are increasing defense budgets very much and are also using the fear argument that Europe needs to defend itself and so on, in order to gloss over the obligations under international law and are therefore willing to buy weapons even from companies that are clearly criminal companies, Israeli companies that are violating international law. And my question is, what are our counter arguments against this fear that is used to manipulate us into overlooking the violations of international law? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions posed to the panelists. And before they answer those questions, I wish to encourage each of you, following your answers, to make any final remarks before we conclude this plenary and move to the closing session. So, okay, just one more question before we conclude with our panelists.
Susan Smith, International Fellowship of Reconciliation and the International Weaponized Drone Ban Treaty Campaign. We've heard a lot today, and I really appreciated the words of Bari from the Palestinian American Community Center, talking about the tools of accountability and how really when looking at the six apparatus of accountability, Security Council, GA, International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, regional state organizations, and international civil society. It really is civil society that is pushing and raising this bar at this time. And in that light, we have not spoken today or yesterday about the upcoming so-called two-state solution conference. That this is an historic conference. And all we know, and I believe it was Mr. Lynk, the only one who really referred to it, that the low bar is that at that conference we are supposed to look at the implementation of the September resolution E24, the UNGA resolution E24. So this being the case, and knowing that the two hosts of that conference, one is France, which has not yet recognized Palestine, and the other one is Saudi Arabia, which assassinates and dismembers dissent, which holds its princes under house arrest, which kidnaps the prime minister of Lebanon and forces him to announce that he's resigned, that bombs Yemen into oblivion, that enters into deals with Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump, which are tied to investments in the occupied territories. How is it that these are to be two brokers of something under the auspices and the umbrella of the United Nations, which is then going to give it legitimacy? And I say that also appreciating, as was said yesterday by someone, that His Excellency Ambassador Riyad Mansour is in one of the most difficult positions. And he is a very esteemed, honorable, and wonderful diplomat, but here he is in this position. So can we talk about this upcoming two-state solution conference and what is going to happen and how did these two brokers come about? And is something terrible going to happen under the auspices of the UN? I think we need to walk into this with our eyes wide open. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I would just refer to the discussion that was had yesterday regarding the two-state international conference. It is an international conference as per General Assembly Resolution ES 1024 for the achievement of a peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution. And the legal foundation for the conference is very clear, as enshrined in Resolution ES 1024, which was adopted in follow-up to the ICJ advisory opinion. And all of the authoritative determinations made by the ICJ in that advisory opinion are reflected in that resolution. And so that is the guiding framework and that is the foundation for the international conference. The appointment of the two co-chairs was done by the General Assembly in a resolution that was adopted by an overwhelming majority. The resolution is called the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine, and it sets out the modalities for this international conference, which is a multilateral undertaking, which has at its core, again, a peaceful and just settlement of the question of Palestine based on the realization of Palestinian rights, including the right to self-determination and independence of the state of Palestine, and addressing all of the violations of international law and human rights that have been perpetrated by Israel. And again, referencing the ICJ advisory opinion and the call for an end to Israel's illegal occupation, for respect for the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, for respect for the right to independence and sovereignty of the Palestinian people in their state of Palestine, and even for reparations, which the ICJ was very clear about. And so that is the legal framework and the foundation for the international conference. We are hoping for participation by states at the highest levels, and as Minister Mansour said yesterday, that we are seeking for this conference to be one of action, to be one in which states will announce what they commit to do to end this illegal occupation, to end the atrocities being perpetrated against the Palestinian people, and to assist the Palestinian people to finally achieve their inalienable rights. And I think that that is where the convergence comes with the efforts of civil society. You are all calling for and advocating for the same thing, using different tools, whether it's boycott, divestment, and sanctions, whether it is the demand for an arms embargo, whether it is exposing the complicity and the double standards. And all of that should converge to achieve those common objectives from different directions. And now I will give, again, the floor to our panelists. We can, again, go clockwise to answer the questions that were posed, and also if you could please make your concluding remarks. Thank you.
I'll go first. I think there were three questions that were posed. The first had to do with issues involving the current state of the genocide in Gaza and op-eds. Why should we be writing op-eds? We should all be writing op-eds with respect to this. And I say this as a Canadian who learns a lot from the occasional op-ed that gets into the New York Times, that is principled, that is based on rights and international law. And I'm amazed that it gets into the New York Times, and how I wish we would see something comparable in my home country with respect to this. And that puts the onus on me to be able to start writing these in Canada, but also for all of us to try to find all the media outlets possible to be able to spread the word of civil society. The second question had to do with the resilience of international law. And I think the question in particular, and I want to compliment Shirhavar, just on another ground, I've learned, I said to you this yesterday, but I want to say it publicly, how much I've learned from your writings over the years with respect to the Israeli economy and its ties to, obviously, occupation. And you were writing both bravely, but also in a responsible and reliable way, that someone like myself could be able to use your work as Special Rapporteur. And I want to compliment the great path of research that you've given to all of us. Your question was, are there examples of international law being used to point to highlight the complicity of another state with respect to war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide that are being committed by a state? Listen, there was litigation, and successful litigation, in Britain in the 1970s and 1980s, all around both the actions of unions and particularly dock workers to try to stop shipments going to and from South Africa. There was litigation as well as to whether or not municipalities had the right, if you like, to form their own foreign policy of either passing resolutions against apartheid South Africa and the actions of the Thatcher government, or of actually taking steps of divesting in companies that were invested in apartheid South Africa during that time. And big things have happened since then. I would point primarily to the enactment of the Rome Statute of 1998, which created the International Criminal Court, but it didn't only create the International Criminal Court. Most of the 124 countries that have become members of the Assembly of State Members for the Rome Statute have domesticated the Rome Statute into their own domestic legislation, as we have here in Canada. In Canada, we have the Geneva Conventions in our domestic legislation. In Canada, we have the Rome Statute in our domestic legislation. And that's true for most European countries and for a number of other countries that have signed on to the Rome Statute. We have underused this extremely valuable tool to be able to force our own governments through laws they themselves passed and committed themselves to that have the definitions of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, of genocide, to be able to live up to the promises they made when they enacted this legislation, to ensure that that passage of that legislation wasn't simply noble and performative, but actually has meaning. But it's up to us as civil society to begin to use those political and legal tools that those pieces of legislation wind up referring to. And the last point was from you, Susan, with respect to the conference that's coming up in June. I mean, my big fear, as I mentioned, is that the two-state solution has been misused by leaders in the global north to simply say we believe in a two-state solution. Once we sit down and get the parties who are so difficult and hard to talk to at each other, once we get them to sit down and bang their heads, then we'll get a two-state solution. And what this two-state solution has wound up becoming is, if you like, Israel's sweet spot. That as long as the global north talks about a two-state solution, but does nothing to prevent its erosion by the fact that 20 or 25,000 more settlers each year are into the occupied territories, then that's Israel's sweet spot, because there's always then the glimmer of hope that there will be some way of getting to a two-state solution while the occupation steadily eats the possibilities away with respect to that. If you ever encounter a political leader in the north who talks about a two-state solution, I want you to ask them, what's your strategy for getting there? And they do not have one. They do not have one, aside from mouthing the platitude of a two-state solution and just putting the two parties in the room together. They don't have any strategy with respect to the imposition of international law and the UN resolutions and designating Israel as an unlawful occupant and all that would wind up meaning from that.
Yes, I'll start with the term tragedy. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, when I talk about the tragedies that have, the killing of members of the Farah family, relatives of mine, I use the word crime. But maybe Saleh, others who are Palestinian can comment on this. But let me also go to my final remarks. I mentioned that Israeli society will really be shaken to the core when it sees that Western governments are, pushed by grassroots movements, by civil society organizations, force their governments to take real actions. That's when Israeli society starts really feeling the pain, because there really is at the core of this racism, as in the case of South Africa. The whites thought, maybe the people in the West make some noises, but they're really with us. But when they saw that mainstream society in Western countries, in the white majority countries, were really saying, not in our name, that's when things really started happening. But like Phyllis said yesterday, countries should not, abdicate, all countries should not abdicate their duty because the US and Germany and England and France are not taking actions. They should act as the third world countries in the Bandung Conference took positions in support of Algerian liberation as at the time when all the Western countries were complicit in the oppression of the Algerian people. And, it's countries like like I said, it's marginal, so-called marginal groups that always start, the fight against oppression in meaningful ways. In the church space in the United States, the first we heard of strong calls from churches to stop the war in Gaza was from African American church leaders. Over 1,000 African American church leaders were the first to call for a ceasefire when other church leaders were busy condemning the atrocities of the Palestinians on October 7. It was the black leaders who started speaking out. The Bandung Conference, had a huge impact on the emancipation of the Algerian people. But there is that racism in Israel that sees itself as part not of the Middle East, but part of a superior West. So when we reach the mainstream, as I said in my remarks, that's when Israel will start feeling that an internal crisis, psychological crisis, in addition to the economic sanctions and the impact of boycott and divestment.
Thank you, Sheer, for your question. I think we live in a context right now internationally so violent, so colonialist, so racist. The bar is so low, right? The bar is so low that we should not lower our demands. So yes, we have celebrated every action that the Spanish government has taken. But unfortunately, I named the specific actions they've taken to end specific contracts on military trade. But here I would invite you all to read the newest research from Centre de l'As. Centre de l'As is an amazing research group in Spain, and they've just published a new report on the military trade between Spain and Israel. And they say horrifying data like the one I shared, that from fall 2023 until now, Spain has bought over €1 billion worth of weapons to Israel. So we do fully agree in celebrating concrete actions, but what we're saying is that these actions are totally insufficient. And the problem we're facing in Spain is that we're facing a double challenge, because not only are we having to fight the complicity that exists, but also the lies. We have a long list. We have an Excel sheet I'd be very happy to share with any of you, with all the lies that the Spanish president or members of the Spanish government have said when they've said that there are no military relations with Israel since October 2023. And we have even dear colleagues who tell us, oh, the Spanish government, there's a military embargo. No. And that is actually really hurting our campaign in Spain when people are saying that Spain has declared an arms embargo. We wish it had. This is what we're asking them to do, but they haven't. So we fully celebrate the decisions that have been made, but they are totally insufficient. And I agree with you that it's a balance, but I also think that our role as civil society is to push governments, and it's to criticize their actions and to push them to do more. And the severity of what is happening in Gaza means that we have to push the Spanish government until the very end, where there is a real arms embargo on Israel. We have the Spanish president going to the EU saying, oh, the EU should declare an arms embargo. Well, Spain should start. And this is what I was saying before. In this terrifying moment we are in with the rise of the far right, we expect more from governments that identify as progressive, such as Spain, and they should lead by action. This contract that I mentioned, that the Spanish president on April 26 announced that they would cancel, and I emphasize announced that they would cancel, because in October, the Spanish Minister of Defense had already announced the cancellation of this contract. So we need to make sure they actually do cancel it. There are other 9 contracts that have already been formalized that they should cancel immediately. And these are decisions that the Spanish government could take tomorrow. And as I said before, right now we're having to go contract by contract in order to raise pressure. Another example, in the city I live in Barcelona, we have routinely, very often, different Israeli and internationally military companies that are profiting from genocide, that means profiting from killing Palestinians, come to events and arms fairs and technology fairs, and they promote their material. And actually, there was the Israeli Ministry of Economy that came last February to inaugurate Israeli pavilion in the Mobile World Congress. So this is happening on a daily basis, and this is what we are campaigning against. Actually, I said in my speech that we registered last July a draft law in the Spanish Parliament that, if passed, it would declare an arms embargo on countries that are being investigated by the International Court of Justice. And next Tuesday, there's going to be a next step where all the political parties that are part of the Spanish Parliament can vote for the law to pass to a further step, so it can actually be debated in the heart of the Spanish Parliament. So we are asking all political parties in the Spanish Parliament to vote this procedure so that this law can move forward. Yes, I think this is what I want to say. And just my last remarks, I don't think what the gentleman here was saying is extreme at all. I think what's extreme is what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip. I think we all need to do our very best. We all need to do much more than what we're doing. The world is not stopping in front of what Israel is doing in Gaza, so we need to force the world to stop. We need to use people power. We need to use everything in our hands to stop the genocide. Now, there is no more time left, and we need to do everything that we can to stop this. Thank you.
Thanks. On Shir's question, difficult question, I think the way in which we have to try to deal with those sort of companies that develop out of, in a sense, a sort of outsourcing of particularly things like spyware, security, and surveillance, is by making our campaigns now intersectional, drawing the links now. So we're saying what Israel is doing in Palestine is testing on Palestinian bodies the weapons, the spyware, the security equipment, the surveillance mechanisms. And those same things, as has been said, are then exported, particularly to our continent, and making those connections. So we're developing now an understanding that wherever this stuff goes, it's going to be bad news. If it's bad for Palestinians, it's going to be bad news for us. And we've seen this happening. I mean, for instance, Israeli weapons are being used in both sides of the DRC conflict, by Rwanda, which is arming the M23 rebels, and by Tshisekedi and the DRC army, as well as the dirty dealings in extractivism. That's also part of the issues around the conflicts and the ongoing conflicts in the DRC, particularly diamonds. And again, South Africa is selling diamonds to Israel. It has been the second largest export. We export and import them. So obviously we're exporting them raw, importing them back polished, when we're saying what's good for our economy is to, and we have actually beneficiation legislation that should mean we're taking on the tasks of polishing, manufacturing those diamonds, which is job creating for us, and developing skills for us, and making it possible for us to therefore end diamond sales to Israel. But diamonds also, and Israel is deep in this messy business of extractivism in the DRC. Also in the conflict in Sudan, I think it's worth noting the way in which Israel was pushing and pushing and pushing for normalization using the UAE just after the fall of Bashir on the military government at the time. So they are certainly having their own machinations going on in what's now become also a massive, massive famine and conflict in Sudan. The repressive role that Israel plays in supporting the Swazi monarchy is another one. The training of Kenyan paramilitary police, the police who arrested and disappeared protesters who were protesting austerity measures the Kenyan government wanted to introduce. So I think if we can make our struggles, make people aware of the role that Israel is playing in our struggles, in our continent, against austerity measures, where is the repressive tools coming from? That's the way we need to start holding companies to account. So whether they remain in Israel or they transport themselves to other places, we are still keeping our eyes on them, and we're still having a more holistic understanding of what those companies are doing, what they're doing in Palestine that will not end in Palestine, that is already being exported, particularly in our continent. And then I just wanted to say on this issue of where you praise the state parties and your own governments for doing well, and where you continue to keep the pressure. We praise the government of South Africa for taking the case at the ICJ against Israel under the Genocide Convention. We are fully behind this bold move, and we want to do everything we can to support it. So the pressure on South Africa to abandon the case, to be a little less forward on the case, to not to ask for more provisional measures. No, we want to show that that the government has the support of the people to continue its actions. But we also think it's double standards for our government, which has brought about these legal obligations not to implement them themselves. And to continue with trade, we actually still continue with diplomatic relations, although very downgraded, with sports and cultural relations, and particularly this issue of coal, because that is literally fueling the Israeli military, the illegal occupation and the genocide that the legal obligations compel state parties not to do or to be held complicit. So I think it's, there are kind of complications in this world, but that doesn't mean we can let up on state parties. It doesn't mean we can allow gaps to develop in which you therefore get the Zionist lobbies, whether they be churches, whether they be the Zionist Federation, and its all its tentacles which are operating in our country to give them a space. You have to keep the pressure on the government, because otherwise we're going to fritter away and lose the opportunity that South Africa has created. And because of our experience, we know that it's possible, it is possible to act. It is possible to implement sanctions against apartheid states under the rubric of all of the international law relating to apartheid, let alone the genocide, let alone a state that is committing war crime after war crime, human right violation after human right violation. And we know that means state parties have to act. If you are not selling weapons, please, state parties here, make a public statement. Honestly, it's going to act in your favor. On the day in which nobody ever supported this, you really will be held up as a marvelous example. Stand up now and say, my country X is not selling or buying or letting weapons transit. You've got nothing to lose. It's not impacting you negatively, and it can only have a positive impact. It can only make you one of those state parties, like Mandela said, when he came after 27 years in prison to praise the international community at this United Nations, praise the countries that played a role. They will be praising the countries that were part of this committee, that will be part of the Special Committee Against Apartheid when it is revived. Be those countries. There is no other option. Be those countries and play an active part in literally stopping the genocide. Also, not just that, but dismantling the system of apartheid, ensuring the right of return for the Palestinian people, and allowing the Palestinian people self-determination to determine the nature of a future state of Palestine.
Thanks. A very wonderful suggestion, I would say. try to answer the question of European armament now and willing to buy, and what counter-arguments we can have. Yes, we have a massive increase in military spending in Europe and in Sweden, going up from 0.8, I think, % of GNI to 2.6 in 8 years. But Sweden has also, honestly, been willing to buy and sell arms to and from countries violating human rights and international law quite a long time, and countries in war. But what we have seen recently is that we got allowed arms deals and import in a more massive scale from Israel, which we haven't seen before in this scale, and especially import when it comes to Elbit, $170 million US. And we have seen export for the first time in quite a long time. And I'm not so sure that it actually is something that we couldn't buy elsewhere, honestly. So counter-arguments. Well, the simple one is that if Sweden is interested in to work for a global order that is built on international law and UN Charter and human rights, it shouldn't have military trade with countries that are violating that. It will undermine that. So I would say it's our self-interest not to increase in security in the world. And we have to have an agenda for disarmament, because we know also with military investments, it includes risks of making conflicts, military conflicts, and whatever comes with that. So we have a lot of global challenges like climate change, inequalities, gender inequality, crime that cannot be met only with military expenditure and investment within our national borders. And we also know, well researched, that arms trade is often linked to huge problems with corruption and crime. When it comes to Sweden, we have seen the largest example there is the arms deal with South Africa, which, according to police investigations, led to corruption of 1.5 billion rand, or fairly similar to crowns at that time. And it ended up with a settlement in the US, also violating US laws. I think it was in 2011, where the arms companies paid 400 million as just a fine to avoid a court case and to avoid publicity. And when talking about experiences from the South African, I would say also that, yes, South Africa were able to buy oil. They were able to buy arms, but it increased the costs. The international campaigns work like a fine or an extra tax for South Africa to be able to buy these things. And I think that it was also admitted by Neil Barnard, the head of the national security, in interviews, or the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Pete Botha, who now late, who before he died admitted in interviews how the sanction increased the costs for South Africa to stay in power, and that forced them to start negotiations. They didn't say that immediately, but and this was not public, but I think it's a lesson to learn. We increase the costs for oppression. Yeah, thank you.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends, this concludes the discussion for panel 3, and I wish to thank you, Magnus, thank you, Roshan, thank you, Elise, thank you, Philip, and thank you, Michael, We will now begin the closing session of the civil society consultations. You can stay. Oh, wait. Yeah, you can stay. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. On behalf of the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, in my capacity as chair today, I would like to thank all of our distinguished speakers across all of the plenary sessions of these consultations and all who participated in these important discussions. During these consultations, we have had the privilege of hearing voices from different parts of the world and receiving very impactful briefings, critical insights, and calls for action for accountability and justice, as well as immense and heartfelt expressions of solidarity with Palestine. As was said repeatedly, the commemoration and remembrance of the Nakba is not only about marking a historical event, this is an ongoing Nakba. And it is about the need to continue giving voice to the oppression of the Palestinian people under Israel's occupation and blockade, and most importantly, to continue demanding and working for an end to the genocide in Gaza, and demanding and working for an end to this illegal and inhumane occupation, and the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, and a just solution for this historic and grave injustice, including for the Palestinian people to exercise independence in their state of Palestine in accordance with international law and the two-state solution enshrined in UN resolutions. Once again, the upcoming high-level conference on Palestine here at the United Nations General Assembly in June presents a crucial opportunity to revitalize international support for justice and peace and put forward all the fruitful recommendations discussed during these deliberations, ranging from the upholding of the ICJ provisional measures orders and advisory opinions to the non-negotiation and non-weaponization of humanitarian aid and calls for an immediate ceasefire, immediate resumption of assistance, and lifting of the punitive Israeli siege to address the plight of over 2 million Palestinians in a catastrophic situation in Gaza, and to ending the provision of arms and other forms of military assistance to Israel by putting an immediate stop to transfers and suspending all licenses for arms destined to Israel from countries around the world. Ending the systematic brutality perpetrated across decades of Israel's prolonged, unlawful occupation, which is nearing its 58th year. Persecution and blockade is only possible with the international community's political will and support to solidarity campaigns and civil society efforts like yours. Moreover, the committee calls for independent international investigations to establish the full extent of the crimes committed by the occupying power, particularly in the context of its war on Gaza, to establish justice for all victims. Once again, on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank all of the distinguished experts who joined us in these past 2 days for these civil society consultations. This event has highlighted the need for the committee to continue actively engaging and coordinating with civil society in our shared efforts to achieve a peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. Once again, we are grateful for the opportune timing of this event, considering the high-level conference that will be forthcoming on Palestine in the UN in the coming weeks. All of your inputs and insights have helped us to better inform our collective efforts and to amplify the global call for justice for the Palestinian people. I would also like to thank the entire committee and its bureau for their active participation and the Division of Palestinian Rights of the United Nations Secretariat for the work that went into organizing this event. The chair's summary of the conference will be posted on the website of the committee at www.unispal.un.org. It is now my honor to give the floor to the representative of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, His Excellency Minister Riyad Mansour, to deliver closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Fida. And I want to associate myself with the appreciation to the work of the committee, the division, the presenters, to all of you who have been with us for 2 days, sharing with us your experiences and your efforts in dealing with immediate issues related to the Palestinian people and their situation. In the forefront of that, your appreciated efforts in continuing to pressure governments, institutions, UN, to bring an immediate end to this genocidal war against our people. I know for almost 18, 19 months, we all worked together. You in the streets, lobbying governments, institutions, and we fighting here at the UN with member states, with countries, in order to legislate resolutions in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council, everywhere, to bring an end to this war, because this is an immediate responsibility to save lives of the Palestinian people, especially those in the Gaza Strip. We succeeded for a few days. We saved lives for a few days. Then we succeeded in having a resolution, 2735, that adopted the concept of the 3 stages of a ceasefire, which later on an agreement was agreed to on the basis of resolution 2735. Had Israel accepted to implement that resolution during the course of 6 months before the agreement, we would have saved thousands and thousands of lives of Palestinian people. But even to come late is better than not to come at all. We saved so many lives during the 42 days of the ceasefire. But yet, the Israeli government, representing the occupation forces, broke the ceasefire and continued that war. So our job, all of us, need to continue with this top priority. We need to stop this genocide. We need to stop this war. We need ceasefire. Your slogan in the streets of so many cities across the globe, ceasefire now, need to be repeated. We need to stay the course until we accomplish that. We need to save the life of the Palestinian people. And for of you who do not know, it was us, the victims. Always solutions, they come from the victims. They don't come from anywhere else. We articulated 3 objectives in the first few days of this war. We, the delegation of the State of Palestine, which became the platform and the program for everyone. Number 1, stop the war, stop the aggression, ceasefire. Number 2, humanitarian assistance to our people. We don't want either to see them killed by bombs or starve to death. We need to feed them. And number 3, to fight against the crime against humanity of forced transfer. These 3 simple slogans, humanitarian in nature, became the platform of everyone. It was articulated by the victims, by the Palestinian people, by our people, especially in Gaza, through their representative, which is us here at the United Nations. Now, this is the first and top priority that we need to continue working until we accomplish it. then we need to move into the reconstruction of Gaza. It is a precious part of Gaza, of our essence, and we will never forget it, nor we will make it a Rivera for somebody else at the expense of expelling 2.3 million Palestinians. We need to rebuild it. We have a plan adopted by the Arabs, by the OIC, regardless of what anyone can say about this country or that country. That plan was adopted. It was developed by the Palestinians. Then it became a global plan, even supported by the European Union. So once we have a ceasefire, then we need to move into the reparation, early recovery, reconstruction. It's a plan known. If you need copies of it, we will provide it to you, composed of 3 stages. First 6 months, we need early recovery, people to go back. The courageous Palestinian people, almost 500,000 of them, in a span of 2 days, each day 2 hours, they marched back to ruined homes in the northern part of Gaza. That was the answer to those who said that this is a demolition site and nobody should live in it. That was the answer of the Palestinian people, started from their feet. And I love walking because I know good ideas come from the feet, because I love to walk and think. Some of our leaders in the past used to do that, and they were right, that thinking come, for some of us, from our feet. And then the second stage of building. After, in the first place, we need to have sites where we can have temporary housing, when we can repair some schools, some hospitals, fix the roads, the desalination plants, electricity, to bring back life to Gaza. That's 6 months in the plan, to be followed by 2.5 years of building, so that once we finish building temporary housing, people leave it and they go to permanent housing. And then the final stage to finish everything else that need to be finished to rebuild Gaza again. Along with all these things, again, the victims. We have a plan. The plan is we want this occupation to end, this illegal occupation to end. The ICJ, which again, we had the plan to go to it through tedious discussions, picking brains, disagreeing, agreeing, until we reach the appropriate moment for the timing and the appropriate questions that were articulated. Our job was to drill our legal team about when can we go, when is the appropriate time. We will decide it with you. The questions, we will tell you what we want, you put it in a legal language. That's how we worked with all of our team, including Michael Lynk, until, in our opinion, we reached the perfect moment to move. We did, and we had a historic advisory opinion from the ICJ. And based on it, we went to the General Assembly. Based on it, we legislated as a modality that the ICJ asked for from the General Assembly, the convening of this international conference. Now, each and every one is supposed to do what you think is right to help the Palestinian people to put an end to this genocide and to allow us to rebuild our life and to allow us to accomplish our inalienable rights, including the right to self-determination, statehood, and the return of the refugees. This is what we legislated when Yasser Arafat came to the General Assembly. We, the Palestinian people who were treated as refugees in the agenda of the UN by Arab countries. We were not present there. But when we came back, through a resolution to grant us an observer PLO seat, which we invented because it doesn't exist in the agenda, in the Charter of the UN or the Rules of Procedure. We invented it. The second resolution after the invitation as an observer was Resolution 3236, which calls for the attainment of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, to statehood, and the right of the refugees. These are our rights, and these rights will be accomplished. And this international conference that we called for, the essence of it, we want to move from reiterating principles and saying all the things that we say in all of the resolutions, almost 1,000 resolutions, in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, and in the Human Rights Council and other organizations of the UN. We need to begin the process of implementation. What gave us the strongest legal base to begin the process of implementation is the ICJ, that this illegal occupation has to end, and it has to end quickly, and the General Assembly said it has to end in 1 year. And that's why the international conference has to do that. Is it an easy job? It is not. There is no silver bullet. We learned that from Nelson Mandela. We learned that from the struggle of all those who put an end to colonialism. There wasn't an easy journey for anyone. But we listened to them. They were patient, they were wise, and they appreciated every help from every country, from the international community. I cannot pick and choose. I need everyone at the UN. I wish they give me everything that I ask for. I wish. But I don't have the luxury to say, either give me everything that I want or you are no good. Maybe some of you might have the luxury to say that, but I cannot. I cannot, because it is in the interest of the Palestinian people to keep widening the base of support for our people. That's in the interest of the Palestinian people. And the more support we have, the more we appreciate that. We are not naive to come to the conclusion that they are giving us what they want. Nobody gives us anything without us working so hard for it, and with your help helping us to do it, and still we are not very close to the end line. I was in the morning in the meeting of the entire General Assembly in preparation for this international conference, where the two co-chairs were there and they said what they said. And the co-chairs of the 8 roundtables. So we had 16 of them. We played a role with others to select the co-chairs that are effective, powerful, can be influential in terms of moving from reiterating principles to implementations of resolutions, implementation of things to shorten the life of this illegal occupation. We need to end it. We need to live an independent state of Palestine. The Europeans will never and were never the engineers of the two-state solution. It was the international community in 1947 when they adopted the partition plan, and it was us, the Palestinians, when we made the historic compromise in 1973 and called for the two-state solution. Before, tens of years later, it became fashionable to support the two-state solution. So we know the history. We are marching with pain and tremendous amount of sacrifices in order to accomplish our objectives. In that meeting in the morning, we gave a statement after the co-chairs, said what they said, and we will be more than happy to share it with you, a short one, but framing what we want from this conference. It is a huge test to our collective struggle. Can we move the needle from just telling me a lot of things of principal nature without legs to walk on them into giving me commitment. Even commitment, as my sister from South Africa said, and I say it to my comrades from countries who are close to Palestine, such as Cuba and others, you don't have relationship with Israel, but at least make declaration to encourage others to take practical steps that you will never deal with settlements. You will impose sanctions against settlers. I know you don't have anything to do with the subject, but say it. You have nothing to lose. It encourages others who are frozen in place to take a step in the direction of committing one practical step in the right direction. We know what we're doing. We learned from all others who were our teachers, not only Palestinians, but from all corners of the globe. Now, if we succeed in moving the needle in the direction of countries announcing commitment that I will impose sanctions, that I will not sell weapons or send weapons to Israel, steps that those who did not recognize Israel to recognize Palestine, state of Palestine, to take that step led by France. So France was not giving a free gift. You take that post, you pay the price. And the price is recognize the state of Palestine, so that Canada, among others, to follow them. More recognition of the state of Palestine, although to some it might appear small, symbolic, but it's important in the march of towards freedom and independence for the Palestinian people. And there are a number of things. We said this meeting, all these roundtables, we don't want reiterations of principles. That we did it in the resolutions. We've been doing it for tens of years. Now we want to make a turn. If we succeed in beginning the turn, bending in the arch of justice, bending in the direction of beginning the process of dismantling this illegal occupation, then although it looks very dark now and very depressing, but we want to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Because this is how we can give our people hope, because our people gave us the best thing that they can give. They sacrificed tremendously in order to keep the hope alive. This is how we operate. Therefore, I ask each and every one of you, as we fight here at the UN with countries, to commit to practical things, to dismantle this illegal occupation as quickly as possible. Do everything possible with your governments and in the street. Stop the war in one hand. What are you going to do to end this illegal occupation? And any small step or big step or medium step in that direction will be joining with the effort of all of us in order to break the backbone of this illegal occupation. And we have to break the backbone of this illegal occupation. All the others before us, it was dark for them. Nelson Mandela, when he came to the United States after he was free from Robben Island, he entered the United States with a waiver that he is a terrorist. And 4 years later, they removed the classification of the ANC and Nelson Mandela from the Congress of the United States as terrorist organization. Until today, the PLO that was recognized by Israel as the representative of the Palestinian people is labeled in the Congress as a terrorist organization. And we talk to them, and still they consider us as a terrorist organization. So what I want to say, we thank you very much. We are on the same page. We are not stepping on the feet of each other. We should be looking forward. Each and every one is supposed to channel the efforts in the direction of practical steps, whether in your case with your governments, to take practical steps to end this occupation, our responsibility to keep fighting with all states in the ICJ, in the ICC, everywhere. It took us 10 years after joining the ICC to agree to begin the investigation. We are patient. All revolutionaries, all people who struggled against oppressions, against colonizations, were super patient. We are like them, and we are like our people who are in Gaza and in Jenin and in Tulkarem. So therefore, we are together, we are partners. We appreciate what you do. We thank you for what we do. Keep doing what you're doing. Be more creative, and be assured that we are fighting like you in the same trenches. And one day, these qualitative accumulations will create a quantitative change, and that quantitative change will be breaking the bone of this illegal occupation, and Palestine will be free. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Minister Mansour, for your very moving closing statement, inspiring our collective efforts, our collective struggle in support of life and of justice and freedom for the Palestinian people and the long overdue just and peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, we have now come to the end of the civil society consultations on international action for ending the Nakba and realizing the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. We encourage and look forward to your participation in future events and consultations and your continued support for the important mandate and work of this committee. With deepest gratitude for all of your solidarity and efforts, this meeting is adjourned.